They burned us on a Tuesday. I knew it would be Tuesday, 3 months before it happened. Knew the exact way the morning light would slant through the prison bars. Knew how many stones the crowd would throw before the flames caught. Knew that my sister would whisper, "I love you," 7 seconds before the smoke took her voice forever. I carved the date into my skin with a stolen nail. The 17th of June, 1755. The scar was still fresh when they tied us to the stakes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The thing about seeing the future is that it ruins you for storytelling. You always want to skip to the ending, to the only part that matters. Let me go back. Let me tell you how 2 girls who could see tomorrow learned that knowing changes nothing. The first time Magdalena saw the trembling earth split open the cobblestones of Lisbon, she was kneading bread in her mother's kitchen. Her hand stopped mid-motion, flour cascading from her fingers like ash, and her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. Her younger sister Clara screamed, but their mother Maria slapped her quiet and held Magdalena's convulsing body against the stone floor. When the vision passed, Magdalena spoke in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "The ground will dance and the sea will rise. All the pretty churches will fall into dust. The people will burn, burn, burn." Their mother crossed herself and whispered prayers until her lips went numb. She had known. Of course. She had always known. Her daughters were cursed with the sight, just as her grandmother had been before the Inquisition took her away in chains. That was in August. By November, when the All Saints' Day earthquake reduced Lisbon to rubble and flame, killing tens of thousands in minutes, the Pereira family had already fled north to Porto, taking only what they could carry and the terrible knowledge that they could never speak of what they knew. But silence, as they would learn, carried its own damnation. The sisters were 11, and 9 when they arrived in Porto, their mother's savings sewn into the hems of their threadbare dresses. They took a cramped room above a tannery on the Rua das Flores, where the stench of curing leather seeped through the floorboards and stained their dreams with visions of flayed skin and chemical burns. Maria found work as a seamstress, her needle flying through silk and wool by candlelight, while her daughters slept or pretended to sleep in the narrow bed they shared. Magdalena was the elder by 2 years, with black hair that hung in heavy waves to her waist and eyes the color of deep water. She had their father's angular face and serious mouth, though neither sister could remember him clearly anymore. He had died of fever when Clara was still learning to walk, leaving behind only a wooden crucifix and a reputation for prophecy that their mother desperately tried to bury. Clara was softer, rounder, with their mother's honey-colored hair and a spattering of freckles across her nose. She smiled more easily than her sister, but her laughter had grown rare since they left Lisbon. The visions came to her differently than they came to Magdalena, not in violent seizures, but in whispers that only she could hear, voices that called to her from shadows and empty rooms, telling her things she wished desperately not to know. "The baker's wife will lose her baby," Clara murmured one morning as they walked to the market, her voice so quiet that Magdalena had to lean close to hear. "Tonight, there will be so much blood." "Don't," Magdalena hissed, gripping her sister's hand until Clara winced. "We don't speak of these things. We never speak of them." But Clara's eyes were already distant, focused on something beyond the narrow street and the morning crowds. "She's screaming now," she whispered. "In the future, can't you hear her?" Magdalena could. That was the worst part. She could always hear them, the chorus of the damned, the soon-to-be dead, the marked ones, whose fates were already written in blood and ash. They filled her skull with their wailing until she thought her head would split open like an overripe fruit. That night, the baker's wife miscarried twins, and nearly bled to death on her kitchen floor. The midwife saved her, barely, and the baker got drunk and beat his apprentice, bloody in his grief and rage. The sisters lay awake in their bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to their mother sob quiet prayers in the corner. "We could have warned her," Clara whispered. "And what would that have changed?" Magdalena replied, her voice hard as stone. "Nothing. It would have changed nothing except to mark us as witches. Is that what you want? To burn like grandmother?" Clara said nothing, but tears leaked from the corners of her eyes and soaked into the pillow they shared. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very marrow of their bones. The tannery below them shut down when the owner died of pneumonia, and the building fell silent except for the rats that nested in the walls and the wind that howled through gaps in the shutters. The visions grew worse. Magdalena began to see them even when she was awake. Transparent figures moving through solid walls, their faces twisted in agony or terror, or both. A man who would hang himself from the rafters of his workshop. A child who would drown in the Douro River come spring. An old woman who would choke on her supper and die alone, undiscovered for 3 days until the smell brought neighbors to her door. She scratched the dates and times into the soft wood beneath their bed with a stolen nail, creating a calendar of catastrophes that only she could read. January 12th, February 3rd, March 27th. The marks multiplied like cancer cells, spreading across the underside of their bed frame in a grotesque constellation of future suffering. Clara's gift manifested differently. She began to draw. With stolen charcoal and the backs of old letters and bills, she sketched the faces of the dying with an accuracy that was almost obscene. She drew a merchant's bloated corpse pulled from the river. She drew a woman's face, half melted by smallpox. She drew children, so many children twisted and broken in ways that bodies should never break. Their mother discovered the drawings hidden beneath Clara's side of the mattress on a gray afternoon in February. She stood in their doorway, clutching the terrible portraits in her trembling hands, her face ash white. "Burn them," she commanded, her voice shaking. "Burn them all. Now." "But Mama," Clara began. Now. They burned the drawings in the small fireplace, watching the faces curl and blacken and turn to ash. But the images remained in Clara's mind, as vivid as ever, and new ones came to replace them every night. "Why?" Clara asked her sister that evening, her voice thick with tears. "Why can we see these terrible things if we can do nothing to stop them?" Magdalena had no answer. She was beginning to suspect that there was no answer, that they had been cursed for no reason at all, or perhaps for the worst reason, that God was cruel and capricious, and suffering amused him. Spring arrived with plagues of its own. An outbreak of dysentery swept through the poorest quarters of Porto, turning the river brown with filth and filling the mass graves on the city's outskirts. Magdalena and Clara saw every death before it happened, felt every victim's agony as if it were their own. The visions began to overlap, creating a palimpsest of horror that never ceased. They would watch a man eat his breakfast and simultaneously see his corpse 3 days hence. They would pass a laughing child in the street and know the exact moment when fever would steal the light from her eyes. They stopped sleeping. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant being trapped in the visions with no escape, forced to watch every terrible moment. From beginning to end, they sat up through the nights, holding each other and whispering prayers that neither of them believed would be answered. Their mother grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, earning barely enough to keep them fed. She took in more sewing work straining her eyes by inadequate candlelight until she had to hold the fabric inches from her face to see the stitches. Magdalena saw the future when her mother would go blind from the strain, saw her begging in the streets, saw her dying cold and hungry in a stranger's doorway. She said nothing. What would be the point? In April, a woman came to their door. She was tall and thin, dressed in black silk that whispered when she moved. Her face was heavily veiled, but Magdalena could see the glint of intelligent eyes studying them through the dark lace. She carried herself with the bearing of nobility, though she came unaccompanied and on foot. "I have heard," she said without preamble, "that you possess certain abilities." Their mother tried to close the door, but the woman's gloved hand shot out and held it open with surprising strength. "I mean you no harm. Quite the opposite. I wish to employ your daughters for a single task. The payment will be generous enough to change your circumstances considerably." "We have no abilities," Maria said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "You've been misinformed," the woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your elder daughter had a seizure in the market 3 weeks ago. She spoke of a fire on the Rua do Sudo. 2 days later, 6 buildings burned. Your younger daughter drew a picture of Senhor Oliveira's corpse before he fell from his roof. These facts are known to those who care to listen." Magdalena felt ice water flood her veins. They had been so careful, or so they thought. "What do you want?" she heard herself ask. The woman turned her veiled face toward Magdalena, and even through the lace, her gaze felt like a physical set. "Wait. My husband plans to murder me," she said simply. "I wish to know when and how so that I might prevent it. Tell me this, and I will give your mother enough gold to leave Porto forever. To disappear somewhere, the Inquisition will never find you." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the street below. Maria's face had gone from white to gray. "And if we refuse?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I will have no choice but to inform the authorities that I have witnessed the Pereira family engaging in witchcraft and prophecy. I imagine they would be most interested to learn about the grandmother who was burned in Lisbon for the very same crimes. It wasn't a choice. It had never been a choice." The woman's name was Dona Beatriz Almeida, and she was the wife of a wealthy wine merchant whose estates sprawled across the Douro Valley. She brought them to her townhouse under cover of darkness, leading them through servants' passages to a lavishly appointed bedroom where the air smelled of roses and something else, something sweet and rotten underneath. "Tell me," she commanded, removing her veil to reveal a beautiful face, marred by yellowing bruises along her jaw. "Show me how I die." Magdalena and Clara clasped hands, their fingers interlocking in a gesture they had developed over years of shared visions. The sight was stronger when they were together, more focused, though also more painful. The vision came in a rush of sensation that knocked them both to their knees. They saw Dona Beatriz's husband, a heavy man with wine-flushed cheeks and cruel eyes. They saw him mixing white powder into his wife's evening wine arsenic. Though the sisters couldn't name it, they simply knew it was poison. They saw Dona Beatriz's face contorted in agony as her stomach burned from the inside out. They saw her collapse at dinner while her husband watched with false concern. Saw the doctor who would be paid to declare it a bay, natural death. Saw her being lowered into the ground while her husband inherited everything she had brought to their marriage. But they saw something else too, something that made Magdalena's breath catch in her throat. They saw Dona Beatriz in a different future, standing over her husband's corpse with bloody hands and a butcher's knife. They saw her fleeing into the night, with stolen jewels. They saw her drowning in the river 3 months later, weighed down by her guilt and the stones she had sewn into her skirts. When the vision released them, both girls were gasping and soaked with sweat. "Well?" Dona Beatriz demanded. "When? How?" Magdalena's mouth opened, but no words came out. Which future should she tell? Which one was real? Or were they both real? Branching possibilities that existed in quantum superposition until the moment of choice. Clara spoke instead, her voice dreamy and distant. "He will poison your wine tomorrow night. During the 3rd course, you will die in agony unless you refuse to drink." Dona Beatriz's face hardened. "Then I will not drink, and I will see him hanged for attempted murder." "No," Magdalena said sharply. "If you denounce him, he will turn the accusation back on you. He will say you are mad, that you attempted to poison him. He has powerful friends. You will be the one who hangs. Then what am I to do?" Dona Beatriz's voice rose to a near shriek. "Accept my death? Watch him profit from my murder?" The sisters exchanged glances. In that moment, they made a choice that would damn them both. "Kill him first," Clara whispered. "Tonight, before he has the chance." They helped her plan it. They told her exactly how to do it, how to wait until he was drunk and snoring, how to take the pillow and press it over his face, how to hold it there even when his body thrashed and fought. How long to wait to ensure he was truly dead. They told her because they had seen both futures, and in one of them she lived at least for a little while longer. And wasn't a little while better than nothing? Dona Beatriz gave them a purse heavy with gold coins before they left, enough to buy passage to the new world if they wanted, enough to disappear completely. "You have saved my life," she said, clasping their hands in hers. Her palms were clammy, her grip desperate. "I will never forget this kindness." Magdalena said nothing. She had seen the 3rd future now, the one that had been created by their interference. She saw Dona Beatriz smothering her husband. She saw the servants who would hear his muffled cries and break down the door. She saw Dona Beatriz dragged before the authorities, saw her tortured until she confessed not only to murder but to witchcraft, saw her naming the 2 young girls who had used demonic powers to help her plan the crime. She saw herself and Clara in chains, saw the mob that would gather to watch them burn, saw her mother's face in the crowd, twisted with grief and horror. She saw it all, and she said nothing. Because what would be the point? The future was already written. Their choices were only ink. They ran that night, taking the gold and fleeing Porto under cover of darkness. They didn't tell their mother where they were going, better that she could claim ignorance when the authorities came asking. They simply kissed her goodbye and left her weeping in the doorway of their rented room, the candlelight turning her tears to liquid gold. They traveled northeast, avoiding the main roads, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. The visions followed them. They always followed them. In a small village near the Spanish border, Magdalena had a seizure in the town square and spoke of a coming flood that would wash away the church and drown the priest. The villagers drove them out with stones and curses. In another town, Clara made the mistake of warning a pregnant woman that her child would be born dead. The woman's husband beat Clara so severely that she couldn't walk for 2 days. Magdalena carried her sister on her back until they found shelter in a cave in the hills. They lived like animals for weeks, eating berries and roots, drinking from streams. The visions intensified until they could barely distinguish past from present from future. Time became a circle, endlessly repeating, showing them the same tragedies over and over in slight variation. Magdalena began to understand why their grandmother had welcomed the flames. There was a mercy in burning. At least it would end. They were caught on a rainy night in June, huddled in the ruins of an old monastery. The soldiers who found them were searching for deserters, but found two filthy, half-starved girls instead. They would have left them alone, perhaps, if Clara hadn't started screaming. She saw how the captain would die kicked by his horse next week. His skull split open like a melon, and the vision overwhelmed her. She screamed the prophecy at him while Magdalena tried desperately to cover her sister's mouth, to silence her, to save them both. But it was too late. It had always been too late. The soldiers brought them to the local magistrate, who sent word to the Inquisition. They were imprisoned in a stone cellar that smelled of urine and old blood, their hands and feet shackled, left in absolute darkness. The future, when it came, was clear and unmistakable. They saw the tribunal. They saw the torture chamber, the instruments of pain laid out with surgical precision. They saw their confessions extracted word by agonizing word. They saw the auto de fe, the ceremony of faith, where they would be paraded through the streets in San Benitos, the yellow robes of the condemned, before being tied to stakes and burned alive, while priests chanted prayers for their immortal souls. They saw their mother in the crowd, aged a decade in the few months since they'd left her, her face a mask of unspeakable sorrow. They saw it all, in perfect detail, and they held each other in the darkness and wept. The night before their scheduled execution, Clara finally asked the question that had haunted them both since childhood. Why do we see the future if we can never change it? Magdalena was quiet for a long time. Outside their cell, she could hear rats scurrying across stone and the distant sound of someone else's screaming. Perhaps, she finally said, we're not meant to change it. Perhaps we're meant to witness it, to remember, even if no one else will. But no one will remember us, Clara said bitterly. We'll burn, and people will forget we ever existed. No. Magdalena squeezed her sister's hand in the darkness. We'll remember. Even after we're dead, we'll remember. That's our curse, Clara. Not seeing the future, but never being allowed to forget it. Clara began to cry, and Magdalena held her until her sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths. I'm frightened, Clara whispered. I know, so am I. Does it hurt? The burning? Magdalena closed her eyes and let the vision come. She had been avoiding it, but there was no point now. She saw the flames licking at their feet, saw the smoke filling their lungs, saw their flesh blackening and splitting. She felt every moment of it, the agony so intense that it transcended pain and became something else entirely. A revelation, perhaps, or a punishment so perfect it was almost beautiful in its completeness. Yes, she said simply, it hurts. Will you hold my hand? Clara asked. When it happens? Yes, I'll hold your hand. Promise? I promise. They sat together in the darkness, two young girls who had been cursed with the sight of the future, waiting for a tomorrow they had already seen 1,000 times. The morning of their execution dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that made people forget their troubles and smile at strangers. The square filled with spectators hours before the scheduled time, merchants setting up stalls to sell food and drink, mothers holding children on their shoulders for a better view. Magdalena and Clara were led out in their San Benitos, the yellow robes marking them as enemies of the faith. Their heads had been shaved, their bodies bruised from questioning. Clara could barely walk, leaning heavily on her sister for support. They were tied to the stakes, and the bishop read their crimes aloud. Witchcraft, prophecy, consorting with demons. The crowd shouted its approval, eager for the entertainment to begin. As the torches were brought forward, Magdalena looked out at the sea of faces and saw them all at once, every person in the crowd, every moment of their lives from birth to death. She saw them age and sicken and die, saw their children and their children's children, saw the endless cycle of suffering that humanity had built for itself and couldn't seem to escape. She saw that in 200 years, people would write about this day, about two young girls who were burned for seeing the future. Some would call them saints, others martyrs, still others tragic victims of superstition. But none of them would understand the truth. The truth was simpler and more terrible than any of them could imagine. They had died for nothing. Their gift had meant nothing. Their suffering had changed nothing. The future rolled on, indifferent and immutable, like a river that had been flowing since the beginning of time and would flow until the end of everything. Clara turned her head and found her sister's eyes. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." The torches descended. The kindling caught. The flames rose. And in those final moments, as the fire consumed them, the sisters had one last vision, the clearest and most terrible vision they had ever shared. They saw the future stretching out before them like an endless corridor of mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of the same story. People who could see tomorrow burning for it, over and over again, in every age and every place. Sacrificed on the altar of humanity's fear of knowledge, they saw that nothing would change. Nothing ever changed. The fire took them then, and they screamed, because even knowing the future couldn't prepare them for the reality of the present. They held hands until the very end, just as Magdalena had promised, their fingers blackening and fusing together in the flames. Two sisters bound in death as they had been in life. The crowd watched and cheered. The bishop prayed for their souls, and somewhere in Porto, their mother collapsed in her empty room, feeling in her heart the exact moment when her daughters ceased to be. In the years that followed, stories would circulate about two young girls who had been able to see the future. The tales would grow in the telling, becoming legends, then myths, then eventually fading into obscurity, as all such stories do. But sometimes, on certain nights when the air grew heavy and strange, people would report seeing two figures in yellow robes standing at crossroads or outside churches, holding hands and staring at nothing. Some said they were ghosts. Others said they were warnings. Those who claimed to have looked into their eyes said the same thing, that the girls seemed to see through them, past them, into a future that only they could witness. And in that future, those witnesses always said, was nothing but ash and flame and endless, terrible repetition. The curse, it seemed, extended beyond death. The sisters were still watching, still seeing, still unable to change a single thing. And that, perhaps, was the greatest horror of all. You've reached the end of our story, but we have not reached the end of seeing. That's what I need you to understand. Right now, as you read these words, I am watching you. Not as a ghost, nothing so simple or merciful as that. I am watching you from the past, from the moment before the flames took me, when I saw this. Exact instant stretched out before me like a thread pulled taut across 3 centuries. I saw you discovering this account. I saw your face as you read about our burning. I even saw the moment you would finish reading and wonder if any of it was true. It's all true, every word. Clara is here with me in this vision, holding my hand just as she held it when we burned. She wants me to tell you something, though I'm not sure you'll believe it. She wants me to tell you that you have the sight too. Not like ours. Yours is quieter, subtler. You call it intuition, or déjà vu, or a lucky guess. You ignore it, dismiss it, rationalize it away. But it's there. And here is what we learned. What we paid for with our lives and our sanity and our souls. The future cannot be changed, but it must be witnessed. Someone must see. Someone must remember. Even if it changes nothing. Especially if it changes nothing. The curse passes on. It always passes on. So when you feel that strange certainty about what comes next, when you know something you shouldn't know, when you wake from dreams that feel more like memories of tomorrow, don't ignore it. Don't hide it. Don't try to change what you see. Just witness it, remember it, carry it forward. Because 300 years from now, someone else will read about you, and they will wonder if you were real. And somewhere in the space between past and future, you will be watching them read, just as we are watching you now. The fire never really stops burning. We never really stop seeing. And you were always meant to find this story. We saw you coming. Magdalena Pereira, written in ash and memory, the 17th of June, 1755.